QC Pod is a production of the Queen's Podcast Lab. This is QC Pod. I'm Jason Tuga. QC Pod features the people, projects, movements, and ideas that make up the Queen's College community. To learn more, visit us at queenspodcastlab.org/QCPod.
That feeling that being in the front with all these other women, just like mere feet from Slater-Kinney. And if you've heard Corin Tucker's vocals, she has like a really distinctive kind of wail.
Don't say the word if you don't want it done. Don't tell me your name if you don't want it done.
And to be that close, and they use like detuned guitars, so it's just a really powerful sound. And I just was like, oh my gosh, like this is real and this is happening to me.
I remember seeing Babes in Toyland live in New York and just being completely blown away by the power and the honesty, and it was incredibly inspiring and sobering too, to realize like, how did I not see this? But just the energy in the room was absolutely electric, and the sound was completely different. Yeah, it was definitely a watershed moment for me as a fan.
I'm Jason Tuga, and I am really pleased to say that today, Eleanor Whitney and Amy Herzog join me in the QC Pod. Eleanor is the author of Riot Woman, Using Feminist Values to Destroy the Patriarchy, came out just this fall. She's also an MFA student in creative writing and literary translation here at Queen's College. Amy Herzog is professor of media studies as well as department chair over there. Amy also teaches a course in musical subcultures. So we thought it would be great to get Amy and Eleanor together to have a conversation about riot girl culture. Where did it come from? How did it thrive? What did it mean for young women in the 90s and beyond? What are some of its prehistories, its legacies, its complications? We even get into a little disco conversation. It's wide-ranging. I hope you enjoy it. Eleanor, let's start with you. You've published Riot Woman, which is a book that's part memoir, part cultural criticism, and kind of in the way that zines were always both those things. It's very personal, it's very political. Those things are intimately tied for you, obviously. And you're telling your story of discovering Riot Girl, but also telling it from your perspective now and thinking back and reflecting on and critiquing that movement. And I just think there's got to be a story behind this book, and I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. Well, I was a zine publisher. I guess in some ways you always are a zine publisher, right? I published a personal zine called Indulgence, which I named in about 1998 because my 10th grade English teacher said that we were at the height of self-indulgent memoir writing. And I was, recently politicized through Riot Girl and really felt like, the personal is political and our personal stories and experiences matter. So I named my zine Indulgence as a way to kind of skewer that idea that it was just self-indulgent navel gazing. Of course, as a creative nonfiction MFA student, I have a critical response to, I think, some of the memoir writing of the 90s where I'd say, yeah, like my personal preference for reading personal essay is that they do get a little more critical and they aren't just telling a narrative. But that's experience I have later. So I published this zine Indulgence for many years, and I met a really amazing community of mostly women or non-binary people who were writers and artists and musicians through it. And I feel really grateful for that. So in my mid-30s, I started thinking about, to situate us in time, that's about 2014, which is when I first pitched the book to Microcosm. This is when I really felt like neoliberal feminism was ascendant. You know, it felt like we might have our first woman president. You know, Beyonce had like come out with sparkly feminist behind her. There was really cool feminist T-shirts you could buy. That we were having conversations in the tech industry about diversity and inclusion. And I thought, you know, is there still a place for this really community-driven, scrappy, kind of messy, angry Riot Girl feminism that was so transformative for me? Or do we all kind of get in line with this mediated version of feminism? So that was a question I really started writing the book to explore, and really thinking like, what was the legacy of this in my life and in the lives of other people? Then 2016 election happened, and I think that tenure changed. And then I really was starting to think about, you know, what does it mean to inhabit these values in a world where we really need to show up for what we say we value if it comes to inclusion, diversity, and liberation. So that is where I think the book went. And originally it was supposed to come out in 2018, but books take a long time.
I'm also really interested in the way you kind of come at the right here, right nowness of Riot Girl after the fact as well, that both in terms of discovering Riot Girl after it's kind of peaked and is waning, and also coming to it from rural Maine as opposed to one of the urban centers that generally kind of frame all our discussions of Riot Girl, as well as kind of writing about it then in terms of thinking about the legacy now. So there's all these really interesting kind of temporal registers happening here.
Yeah, well, Amy, I'm curious too. You mentioned we're almost a decade apart in age. So I'm curious, you kind of felt like you also were outside of it when you discovered. So what was your experience of Riot Girl? And then I can talk a little bit more about how I discovered it and how that sort of changed or shaped my relationship with it.
Yeah, it was really fun to read you feeling like you had missed out. And I really related to that as being just like a little too, I don't want to say a little too old for Riot Girl, but kind of arriving to it as a slightly older person and realizing how much I had missed out on, realizing how much internalized misogyny I had myself in terms of my relationship to music scenes, not having felt empowered in the same way. So one of the things I loved about your book was how frankly you talked about facing that internalized misogyny and those kind of painful discoveries that don't register necessarily as empowering, but are in fact kind of a painful reckoning.
You do an amazing job describing the pull of the right here, right now quality of Riot Girl. Just that immediacy that made it seem like change was possible in the moment. And I'm sure Amy's got thoughts about this too. So what I would love to do is just turn it over to the two of you to have some conversation about what that meant to you at the time when it was happening.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that is something, just to speak to that for a second, that stays with you. Like, I think in writing this book, one thing I was grappling with is we're never done with liberation or with being a feminist. It's a process, and it should be, because nothing's static in our lives. So maybe the internalized misogyny that we wrestle with at 17 is really different than 40, but it's still there and it's still a process. So I think that was another thing I really wanted to write the book about. And I think especially when we're trying to, on like social media and things, present ourselves as these like complete activists and artists, it's just not true. So I really wanted to explore that. And yeah, I, like you said, I grew up in rural or suburban Maine. There was sort of a punk or indie music scene, but it was really just a mishmash of kids who liked music because there weren't enough people to have a differentiation, say, between these differences that maybe don't really matter, like crust punk and hardcore and art rock and whatever. And I think I was the only girl I knew who played guitar in a band at that time. That doesn't mean I was the only one, but I was the only one I knew. So that felt really isolated. So I discovered Riot Girl specifically because of a Spin magazine article that I read in about 97. And it was definitely a back issue. So I think this article probably ran in like 94 or something, but it was like Inside the Riot Girl Revolution. And I just saw it and I was like, oh my God, I have to be part of this. And I don't care if it's not still going, or I don't care if that was in Olympia, Washington. Like I want this here now, because there is such an immediacy to the music, to the writing that goes along with it, and the zines, and even the fashion. It's very in your face. And of course, I think that mainstream media really picked up on the fashion element of it as sort of a way, I think, to both disseminate it further, but also trivialize it. Like, look at these young women with slut written on their arms. Oh my God. And article after article really like fixates on that specifically. Like, it was very titillating for the media, but in a way that's what enabled girls like me who did not, we're not going to a really liberal arts college like Evergreen at the time, or we're not in an urban center to discover it. And I think I would say the original organizers of Riot Girl were so savvy, people like Kathleen Hanna, to be like, yeah, this is a movement that's everywhere, even if it wasn't true. Because then young women did starting, Riot Girl chapters in their towns and be like me and be like, well, I'm just going to find it and make it. But not to go on and on and on. But I did think it was really interesting when I read Sarah Marcus's book, Girls to the Front, which is much more of like a clear-cut history of Riot Girl. Whereas, like Jason said, this is like part memoir, part cultural analysis. Riot Woman is. Sarah talked about feeling very outside of Riot Girl, even though she grew up in like the DC suburbs and could have gone and then eventually did go to meetings. So I think that's a really shared experience also of being a young person, and how you often feel you've missed out, even if you look back and say like, no, I was just doing my own thing and was my own person at that time.
It's interesting. I actually can't think of anyone I know who was involved in the scene, really even in the height of it, who identifies themselves as a Riot Girl. There's always this sense that it was happening somewhere else, or there were so many people that were left out in different ways, and that was part of the reckoning, but also part of, I think, what made its legacy so rich was people thinking about that discomfort of who was left out.
Yeah, definitely. And I always love, I always talk about, it's really important to say that, we had the internet in the 90s, kids, but, but we're talking dial up, or maybe, by 99 or 2000, you had cable modem or DSL or whatever it was. But, you weren't spending a lot of time on the internet. You often shared it with your phone line so that your parents would get mad at you, like, get off, I need to make a call. But, would chat on AOL Instant Messenger. So there was sort of a connection. But when it came to really broadcasting and sharing things in this immediate way, zines for me were really where it was, or, making a cassette tape of songs that you wrote where you could just record it on your boom box, or maybe your friend's 4-track recorder if once you got more advanced or something like that.
It's such a different audience too. The way that the mixtape or the zine is pitched in this very intimate way, that I'm actually curious how younger generations who are only used to the kind of mass audience of social media, which has its niches, but it's not the same as the intimacy of picking up a handmade and stapled zine that is only available on paper, that's been mailed to you by someone from across the country.
Thinking about how soon after that Sleater Kinney show I went to in Boston, my friends in Boston who I met through making zines started a kind of zine distro specifically at shows because they wanted people to interact more at shows and they wanted there to be more exchange. It was called the Boston Free Dance Movement. I mean, we're talking about Boston. It's a pretty buttoned up city. I'm from New England. It's not my favorite place. My parents kind of rag on it. They still, you hate Boston. I'm like, yeah, it's true. But what was amazing there is that they were motivated, I think, through kind of Riot Girl and do-it-yourself ideas to create something where these shows could even be more interactive. And they specifically picked bands that were kind of Riot Girl or indie pop. And I think what people kind of don't, I know now like the indie pop or twee sound is still kind of popular, but at the time it wasn't so separate from Riot Girl, and it was still, I felt pretty political. After my sort of first initial very messy art rock band, I played in an indie pop band and actually went on a little tour, and it was great. I didn't see there was a separation from being punk and being pop, and I think that's very much in the spirit of record labels like K Records also, who are a big proponent of Riot Girl. But I just thought that was really cool that my friends were able to then do that, and that there was a place within that music scene to keep bringing in different forms of art and continuing the conversation as well. So thanks for speaking to that, Amy, and bringing up that memory for me.
A really interesting framework to think about Riot Girl as doing theory, which it really was, through kind of the spectacle of fashion, through reorganizing the social space of the club by sending the girls to the front and by analyzing where people were in the room and making that part of the project. That's really an incredibly radical act to try to shift the geography of the space that you're in. And the pushback they got for that, I think, speaks to how effective that was. But the zine writing especially is where so much of that work was happening in terms of empowering individuals to distribute and analyze and share their perspectives in this really material, really direct, and as Jason said, very immediate way.
Eleanor, you made me super curious about why it was music that was at the center of Riot Girl. I mean, it was fashion, it was theory, it was criticism, it was theater, it was performance art, it was all kinds of things. But the music really seemed to be the center. And with that in mind, I would love to know whether there was a show or a musical experience of some kind that each of you had that just really rocked you and changed things for you.
I have a bunch, but I remember seeing Babes in Toyland live in New York and just being completely blown away by the power and the honesty and, again, the shift in space, where I had been going to punk shows in New York for many years and just kind of accepted the kind of toxic masculinity that often dominated those spaces without even thinking about it. And to see that flipped was, just like this curtain had been lifted from my eyes that it didn't have to be this way. It was incredibly inspiring and sobering too, to realize, like, how did I not see this? But just the energy in the room was absolutely electric, and the sound was completely different. It was definitely a watershed moment for me as a fan.
That's amazing. I imagine that show is incredible. For me, I mean, I've always played music. I think, my parents thought piano lessons would be good for me. And then I think they really unleashed something because I tried so many different instruments, drum, many which are unpleasant. I think if you're a parent, like, oh, great, my fourth grader is playing drums. This is really fantastic. Clarinet. I was a clarinetist for a long time, but I'd always been in sort of the classical or jazz realm. So to find punk and rock really just blew it open for me because I realized like you didn't have to constantly drill on theory and skills. You could just play and express yourself. And that was really freeing. I will say, I think that the sort of feminist proto folk, I don't really know what to call it, of the 1990s was a nice groundwork for me. So Indigo Girls, Ani DeFranco, I had a friend who would introduce me to all that and would gone to a lot of Ani shows. And I really felt like, okay, it wasn't that I didn't think women could play music. Like that was very clear. I'd liked Hole and more mainstream bands like that. But I think what really made it click for me was that DIY element of it, that you didn't have to have the backing of major record companies to express yourself, to make records, to go on tour. And while they were a pretty big band at the time, I think my watershed moment was seeing Sleater-Kinney in 1999 at a club called the Middle East in Boston. I just turned 18, so I was allowed to go. And I remember driving to Filene's to buy the tickets, and they had to like print them out. It's like Ticketmaster or whatever. And me and my friend, drove down to Boston, and it was about 2 hours away from where I grew up. But just, that feeling that being in the front with all these other women, just like mere feet from Sleater-Kinney. And if you've heard Corin Tucker's vocals, she has like a really distinctive kind of wail. And to be that close, and they use like detuned guitars. So it's just a really powerful sound. And I just was like, oh my gosh, like this is real and this is happening to me. And I'm about to leave home. I'm like 2 years away from leaving home, and this could be my world, so it really opened me up in that way. And the Gossip opened, and Beth Ditto also has amazing, powerful vocals and is just an incredible performer. So I think to see, and the Gossip are much closer in age to me, I think, than like the members of Sleater-Kinney. So it's like, okay, these are young people doing this and like going on a national tour and putting yourself out there as possible. So I think that was really transformative. Though I didn't aspire to necessarily be like in a national touring band, because that's a lot of work.
I think at the smaller Riot Girls shows, one of the things I noticed was that, and I do love punk of that era and grunge of that era, and I'm not afraid of the messy distortion, but the vibe in the room would always be one of kind of connoisseurship and the math rock and like really analyzing kind of the precision of what kind of rhythmic things were happening. And the vibe at the Riot Girls shows, first of all, they're just way more interactive. There was room for so much more kind of banter and talk with the audience, bringing the audience up. There's a lot more talking, and room for messiness with the sound, room for poppiness with the sound when that wanted to come in. You didn't know what to expect, and that was really exciting in the way that you knew what to expect, I think, a lot of times from a more traditional punk show.
You both describe sound and the distinctiveness of sound at Riot Girls shows as opposed to, say, other hardcore shows or male-dominated shows, and I'm just really curious to hear, what did it sound like?
Yeah, I love that. I was just thinking about how soon after that Sleater-Kinney show I went to in Boston, my friends in Boston who I met through making zines started a kind of zine distro specifically at shows because they wanted people to interact more at shows and they wanted there to be more exchange. It was called the Boston Free Dance Movement. I mean, we're talking about Boston. It's a pretty buttoned-up city. I'm from New England. It's not my favorite place. My parents kind of rag on it. Me still, you hate Boston. I'm like, yeah, it's true. But what was amazing there is that they were motivated, I think, through kind of Riot Girl and do-it-yourself ideas to create something where these shows could even be more interactive. And they specifically picked bands that were kind of Riot Girl or indie pop. And I think what people kind of don't, I know now like the indie pop or twee sound is still kind of popular, but at the time it wasn't so separate from Riot Girl, and it was still, I felt pretty political. After my sort of first initial very messy art rock band, I played in an indie pop band and actually went on a little tour, and it was great. I didn't see there was a separation from being punk and being pop, and I think that's very much in the spirit of record labels like K Records also, who are a big proponent of Riot Girl. But I just thought that was really cool that my friends were able to then do that, and that there was a place within that music scene to keep bringing in different forms of art and continuing the conversation as well. So thanks for speaking to that, Amy, and bringing up that memory for me.
I'm thinking about projects like Tracy and the Plastics also, which I think in many ways was, I know that Wynn Greenwood also speaks of kind of not feeling a part of Riot Girl, feeling more of a connection to the queercore scene, but creating really performance art that was about interaction with the audience and building kind of multiple layers of that through her video work.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, not to sound like a historian of this at all, but I think when you think about how Riot Girl, one of the places it generated was in Olympia, Washington, in a really specific art scene. So people had been doing performance art and running DIY galleries, and those were the spaces that nurtured Riot Girl. And there were these independent record labels. So I think, and I remember like Becca Albee, who is in Excuse 17. She's also a professor in the CUNY system, I believe, and an artist. Like, she was selling artwork through this little like mail order catalog from Olympia, Washington. And I think even Excuse 17 is like, I don't know, for a Riot Girl band. And yet they're like seen as one of the sort of pillars of Riot Girl bands. So yeah, but it's just interesting. I think we have to remember there was so many different forms of art and expression. Part of it, it wasn't just like fashion and a few bands, which is, I think, kind of how it can get remembered.
Eleanor, I believe you have the inside information about the origin of the name Bikini Kill.
I mean, this... I feel like I'm just quoting Sarah Marcus now, but I've read this in a few different places. Like so Bikini Kill is one of the, formative bands of Riot Girl, and they hosted Riot Girl meetings in DC, but they started in Olympia, Washington, where again, there was this scene of like artists and record producers and bands already happening. And a really important part of that was a woman named Lois Maffio, who writes more like folk and folk rock music, but she, I believe, had done a performance piece referencing something like Bikini Kill, and that's how Bikini Kill kind of got inspired to get their name, was from a performance piece, I believe, by Lois Maffio. So I think what's just interesting in that is just sort of different generations or overlapping generations of women artists inspiring each other, and not just this linear legacy of, say, punk, where it's like, oh, well, this band that inspired this band, but that it's very interdisciplinary as well.
One aspect of your argument that I really admired was the way that you resisted single origins for just about anything, but for the movement of Riot Girl as a whole. Of course, there was Olympia, Washington, and that was real, but there was also a lot of other stuff going on. I mean, you mentioned the Slits, like, there's history there, obviously. And the same goes for the idea of the movement ending somehow. Like, you felt you came upon it when people were announcing its ending in the media. And there are no single endings here either, right? And I guess I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about why Riot Girl has been proclaimed dead so many times.
Yeah, I mean, I think how many times has like feminism been declared dead in the media, right? Like, I think anything that kind of gets taken up by the media, especially that's done by young women or any marginalized group, it's really quick to be dismissed as this passing phenomenon because, it's disrupting the status quo. So I think that was the case with Riot Girl. But I think once the media did start getting really interested, some of the kind of original I don't even want to call them founders, but originators of Riot Girl were kind of like, no, that's over, and this is in the early 90s, that's past. Because I think, too, there was a wanting to dissociate from that sort of stereotyped image of it. So I guess I'm like, and I think that was why I was so mad when I discovered that people were, I got a little tripped up there. I think when I discovered Riot Girl, why I was so mad that people were declaring it dead, I was like, no, like young women's activism isn't dead. Some of us are just figuring this stuff out. So it's still relevant. And I mean, I would say that's probably the same for young people today. Like it's a way to kind of keep you powerless and in despair. Like, hey, these movements aren't dead. These issues are certainly still relevant, whether you're talking about feminism or climate activism or a movement like Black Lives Matter. Those issues, they may go by different names, but they're still really, really important, whether or not something's trending in the media or on Twitter now. Rant over. But Amy, I'm curious, because you also felt like you kind of missed out, quote unquote, on Riot Girl. Like, what was your perception of it? Where I do remember it was like deeply uncool to be into it by the late 90s, but I was deeply uncool as a teenager, so I guess that didn't bother me so much.
I'm going to think about that, but you just sparked a thought for me about the way kind of music coverage declares different movements dead. And I'm thinking about disco, which had like a very definitive like death on Comiskey Field with the disco demolition, and was declared dead, even though if you listen to like the beat structure of dance music post 1979, disco's still alive and well. But it was a separation of the activism and the community, specifically the queer community around disco, that gets left out of the narrative when you declare the death there. So I'm interested in how the kind of anxiety around music and activism coming together as a movement seems so threatening, and the speed with which the media wishes to write them off as kind of passing fancies.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I love that corresponded like to disco. And yet then it's like producers who worked with disco went on and, like produced some of the biggest hits of the 80s, So, and now are venerated as just like total heroes in music and pop culture.
And just the separation from, I don't want to turn this into disco, but the separation from social
I don't know if
context,
this is going to bring these threads together,
the
or
AIDS crisis,
maybe just it's
and
going
what
off
else is
somewhere
happening
that isn't going to
that
make sense, but I want
causes
to know what you
movements
all
to
think.
Shift.
In your book, Eleanor,
is
there's a
interesting
great
too.
section where you talk about
Interesting to think
Latigra's song
about.
Hot Topic, and it's a kind of, I don't know, testimonial to feminist history. It, shout outs to all these icons, that kind of thing. But that song's kind of a disco song, or maybe it's like it actually is just a straight up disco song.
It's completely a disco. Yeah.
Okay, cool. It's a disco song, and I wonder if it brings together threads of Riot Girl and disco, some relationship that was always there. I don't know. Was it?
Well, I actually, I was thinking about 20-year nostalgia cycle. So 2000, 99, 2000, 2001, when suddenly disco, post-punk, like hit it big. So we have bands like La Tigra who are using electronics, dance beats, and for people who are like, who, what? Kathleen Hanna, who was one of the singers in Bikini Kill, and kind of one of its driving forces, went on to make this more like electronic dance project called La Tigra, which I think found kind of more mainstream acclaim in the early 2000s. But I think you also had bands like, frankly, The Strokes or people who were referencing these kind of like post-punk beats, which were totally disco. Sorry, this is I love this music, so you kind of tapped into a nerdy thing. So anyway, I'm just thinking about 20-year nostalgia cycles. So by that time, though, was the sound of disco completely divorced from, its political roots? Or could we say, okay, this was also the start of the Bush era? There's sort of a reason people were picking up this sound again. And I know for me personally, listening to bands from the late 70s and early 80s in 2000, 2001, like early Bush era, really, they felt like they hadn't aged a day. So bands that actually were very influential to Riot Girl, like the Slits, like Gang of Four, these English bands that were very, very political as well. So sorry, Amy, you were going to say something too.
Yeah, no, I'm getting excited now. I would say that Latigra and JD Samson in general are actually kind of the legacy of the real disco in creating queer dance spaces and fighting, being very involved in AIDS activism and politicized, thinking about Giuliani and Bush. Like it that to me is where disco wanted to go. I see a direct connection
Yeah,
there,
that's
actually.
really interesting. And I'm also thinking just in 2000, there was also bands like Chick 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 and Out Hud in New York. And these were the shows I would go to when I first moved to New York. And they were really explicitly political, even though they were really, really fun dance bands. And we're also, yeah, creating that queer dance space, I think, in a very new and I think kind of scrappier way than maybe some of the really produced sounds of disco did at the end.
It was Eleanor who introduced me to one of my favorite podcasts, which is, a series of a podcast hosted by Hanif Abdurraqib. The podcast is produced by KCRW. It's called Lost Notes, and his season's called 1980. And every episode is about a different artist who was making some kind of musical waves in the year 1980, or just music from 1980. Abdurraqib really knows how to tell a good story. And in the Grace Jones episode, he begins with a really evocative retelling of that Comiskey Park episode where they burned all the disco records. And he does an amazing job of showing the underlying racism and homophobia and transphobia that whole situation was about. So I just want to shout out to Hanif Abdurraqib and recommend that episode.
And that also kind of reminds me that I think we also think about punk as, oh, it was this very like straight white thing. And then, Riot Girl was disrupting that, which is really true. But I think in Lost Notes points to this too, is there were punk scenes like the LA punk scene in the late 70s, early 80s were super performance art driven, super queer, definitely not white. And I think there was this reaction to it. And then you saw hardcore kind of coming out that was like very macho, not totally white, but, sort of, I would call it a white boy attitude coming out of that because it was kind of this reaction to this fear, I think, of this much more, I guess, multidimensional universe or way of being. So I think it's just interesting to think about, how there's like these push-pull in music subcultural legacies, which I hope Riot Woman is kind of exploring from a more personal standpoint as well.
This has been such a great and fun conversation, totally illuminating. So thank you, Eleanor, and thank you for writing the book. Thank you, Amy, for being here.
Right. Back at you, Jason. Thanks for making this forum.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. This is so fun and really appreciate all the work you're doing, especially to explore these different formats of media and conversation. So thank you.
And now I would like to just give the two of you an opportunity to close by offering whatever it is you hope the Queens College community will take away from hearing about your experience of Riot Girl, and really especially our students.
I have an idea, maybe just also knowing what my students responded to and were really inspired by, but thinking about like what are lessons for young people now that we might take from the legacy of Riot Girl in terms of creating your own musical spaces, but also thinking about how to the way to channel your creative energy and your activism without being crushed.
That's definitely a great question. And I think this is one of the central questions I was trying to explore in this book and try to answer for myself too, because I think there are various points in the book that were really painful to write about, which was reckoning with the ways that I did feel crushed or that my friends and I did feel crushed. So I think, when I moved to Portland, Oregon in the early 2000s, like full of vim and vigor, like I'm finally moving to the feminist utopia, which and started this or helped start this feminist art collective that just completely imploded and everyone was really mean to each other. That felt really crushing. The Bush years felt really crushing. Mobilizing, the biggest, being part of the biggest, same day demonstrations until the Women's March came along against the war in Iraq and having it happen anyway. Those felt really crushing. So I think I would say what I've been learning is taking a long game and knowing that it's not your singular action that's going to change the world or change your life or fix your community, but it all adds up and it all will connect you to people and ideas that will continue to grow inside you. So I think it's really important for not just young people, but everyone to try things out and to have grand hopes and expectations because you never know. But then to also say, like, it's not just about doing one thing in this one moment, but like how it will keep compounding throughout your life. So for me, the writing of Rebecca Solnit, specifically her book, Hope in the Dark, which is about how actually despair is a privilege and hope is what can continue to drive us, has been so important to me in reckoning with my past and present activism. So if I would distill that for a message, I'd say just try it. And it may not be what you expect, but keep going. And then it's totally okay to step away and to say something didn't work and to pivot. Like you do not need to say the same forever. I think I definitely in the later Bush years really stepped back from community activism because I was just completely burnt out. But I was able to concentrate more on teaching and more on writing, and in a way that brought me back to it. So when 2016 happened, I actually felt like I had a lot of skills I could contribute to my community when it came to organizing. So it's really about thinking like, what skills do I have that I can impact like my community now? So for example, I'm a marketer by trade. So how can I help community newsletters? How can I help someone write their email newsletters or make a social media plan or something like that, where to me, that's no big deal, but that's skills not everyone has. So that's a way I could apply my skills. Or, okay, I know how to make a podcast. Like, could I help a community organization in my neighborhood make a podcast so they can get the word out about what they're doing and share? There's all these things I think sometimes we don't always recognize the skills we have and how they can be useful because we're reaching for something outside of ourselves. And I think as a young person, I really venerated older activist movements and didn't kind of look to see what was like right in front of me that I could have lent my skills and time and energy to that might have felt a little more gratifying.
Yeah. Speaking of long game, you've come into this MFA program already having published this book, published a couple of other books, and you've been talking a lot about how you evolved in relation to Riot Girl, after Riot Girl, and that we're always making ourselves, as people, as activists, as writers, whatever category it is, we're being made and remade. Was that on your mind when you decided to pursue an MFA in creative writing here at Queen's?
I think it's about always being curious to keep learning and not being static with your skills. My first book was a how-to book. I'm a really good how-to writer. It helped me move into marketing, which is how I am paying to go to Queen's College. And I feel so grateful for that. But I realized that's not the kind of book I want to keep writing, that my heart is with literary nonfiction. And I feel like Riot Woman is a step in that direction. And I want to be around peers and keep learning. And I think whatever that is for people, if you can find that, that's so gratifying, because I think we're all told now you're not going to have the same career forever. And I think you're not going to stay the same as a creative person forever either. But then you might cycle back and pick up creative things you left, many years before. I'm starting to play music again for the first time in a long time. And I'm realizing, like, yeah, these 3 chords, they're fine. Like, this doesn't need to be my complicated artist statement. I am writing for that. So I think, yeah, it's just part about continuing to push yourself as an artist and as a person, or else it's boring.
You've been listening to QC Pod, the podcast about all things Queen's College. We're on Twitter at QC Pod and on the web at queenspodcastlab.org/QC Pod. Our theme music is Lake Monsters by John Flansburgh of They Might Be Giants. I'm Jason Tuga. Thanks for listening.